Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about how the world of work and our attitudes to work are changing. This show is brought to you by Virtual Not Distant, a London-based company where we help teams and organizations transition to an office-optional approach. To have a look at what we do and the show notes to our podcast episodes, head over to virtualnotdistant.com. Thank you for spending your time with us. Hello and welcome to episode 204 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. I'm Pilar Orti and I am delighted that you are here with me today, with myself and guests. There are two different voices as well as mine here today. So in this episode, I talked to Luis Magalhaes from DistantJob about his job as Director of Marketing there, where him and his team, they're creating a whole load of content on working remotely as one of the main ways of driving traffic to their website. So I talked to him about that. But I also talked to him about his job as a dentist. And also, this is something that came up near the end of the interview, just because of one of his other job titles. We talk about his love for video games and how that gave him a whole load of skills that he's still using today. And that is something we don't hear about very often. Anyway, it's a very, I really found it very interesting to have that conversation with him. And funnily enough, I've been thinking that Luis is the first person to talk about content marketing in the show. And content marketing is a very 21st century practice, so I'm glad he's doing that. And content marketing is really about creating content as a way of getting your message out as a brand and just your name out. So we do loads. You could say this podcast is part of our content marketing. It's also part of our advocacy. It also pushes out our ideas, and hopefully they're of use to someone, or at least they might even generate some pushback, which is also good because it means the conversation gets going. So something else, at the end of the conversation with Luis, he had an insightful reflection about his own bilingualism. I don't think I've ever said that word before. Bilingualism. So he speaks Portuguese and English. And it prompted a little talking head by myself on leading remote teams of what happens when we're working across the globe. So we'll listen to Luis's interview, then I've got that little talking head, and then building on the link that Luis has with SEO, which is search engine optimization, which is what we do to websites to appear at the top of mainly Google. Because of that link, I thought I'll bring in a little snippet of a conversation I had with Jeremiah Smith, who's the founder of Simple Tiger, who specializes in SEO. So I asked him how he thought the world of SEO would be evolving, and I thought that would be a nice addition to this podcast. So we are evolving the podcast. We are evolving our website. To go and check it out, virtualnotdistant.com. So we might be in for a little bumpy ride as we experiment. But for today, let me introduce a new segment.
What's going on?
What's going on? What's going on? So this is a new segment which I thought would be interesting to formalize some of what I've been saying in the introductions before, and also when I do the episode with Maya Middlemiss, my colleague, will also formalize these what's going on conversations. For today, I've got a few things, but actually I thought I might as well tell you that I was on holiday. I won't usually be doing my own updates, but I think it's interesting and relevant because I was on holiday, but I was also away. So I went to the Mediterranean where we have a flat, and I worked for a bit and I holidayed for a bit. And something I did, which I hadn't done before, is I turned on my out of office reply and didn't book any meetings, any synchronous conversations, and try to stop any conversations with the outside world. And I really enjoyed that. And I think this is something that we can all be thinking about, is how much the work we do relies on conversations with other people, either within or outside the team, and other times where we can manage that flow better in a way that suits us better. So whatever it helps you and your work and your team, because sometimes I still think that there are times when we can hold on with team conversations, put them to one side and concentrate on the work we're doing, and then come back re-energized, rather than, especially now with the wonderful online tools that we have, it can become a bit too much. And suddenly we find that all we're doing all day, in spite of working remotely where we're supposed to be more productive, we're just managing communications. So I think it's really important to find a way that makes sense to you. Teresa Sigilita Hollema very interestingly said, you're very active on social media at the moment. And this was during my time away. And yes, actually, I found I had, because I was thinking a lot, because I was doing a lot, I wanted to engage a lot also. So a lot of time for reflection there. Okay, that's enough. If anyone wants to know more about that, let me know. pilar@virtualnotdistant.com, and I'll tell you a little bit more on the next show. By the way, the air in the Mediterranean Sea was wonderful, but I'm back now in London already feeling the dust. So I already sound a bit more congested than I did yesterday. So this new segment is about stuff that's going on around remote work mainly, but we will include stuff about just the world of work in general, the 21st century work. So 21st century work. So late July, there was an article that came out from BBC News Online. From mainly it was Wake Up to Money, which is a daily show about business, and the article, it came out, it was talking about a remote company with 900 employees that didn't have an office. And this was something new. So I thought, okay, let's see who they are. Who's this company? And it was Automatic with 2 T's, which is the company behind WordPress. And for those of you who don't do anything with websites, WordPress has, I think it was some time ago, it might have, I don't know. At one point it was 80% of the websites were hosted on WordPress. So I thought, I feel a little bit behind the news, because when I used WordPress as an example of a distributed company, I usually say they have almost 500 employees. So keep up, Pilar. But on a serious note, it hit the BBC Wake Up to Money program as something new. As something like, look, this company doesn't have any offices and they have loads of employees. And the company's been around since 2005. And there is even a book published in 2013, which I recommend for anyone wanting to understand how the company started to scale. In particular, it's been written by someone who took on the first management post. It's called The Year Without Pants. And it's only when they hit around 40 employees, they started to need managers. So it's a very interesting book, but it just really hit me that it's only now when the conversation in the mainstream is catching up with what is really going on in that space. So if you are a new listener, welcome. And if you haven't listened to episode 203 yet, do have a listen, because there we cover other areas where the conversation still needs to move forward in the mainstream. And that's one of the reasons why I like to share in the show the conversations that I'm having in my own network, which is full of people who only think about this stuff. So they bring a lot of insights, and they've really been thinking about it for so long. And there's one conversation on LinkedIn I wanted to pull up in a way. And you're going to have to excuse me because the conversation was in Italian and I've used Google Translate just to give us an idea. And this was a post by Giovanni Potts, who is the virtual CEO at BHR and the Happy Remote Work School. And he said, is it possible to be creative as a remote team? And he answers his own question in the post. He says, the answer is yes, we can be creative remotely. I participated in virtual creative sessions led by facilitators, and it was nothing less than a classic brainstorming session, as if it was a brainstorming session all together in the same room. Amongst the most difficult processes to bring online is the creative process, and the common belief is that it is impossible to do it remotely. By dividing the characteristics of the process into personal creativity and group creativity, individuals bring their creativity at the service of a process in which other creative people are involved, and the optimal result should be much more than the sum of the individual parts. Remote individuals should be in a place conducive to creativity and able to inspire it. So first point, cognitively, they should be in a creative state. Second point, once the previous points are solved remotely, the group needs a good facilitator with remote experience. It needs the right technological tools because, for example, the classic post-its are not there, but we do have lots of online equivalents now. And very important, it is necessary to create a closeness of the team because, as Pilar Ortiz says, you should be virtual, not distant. So you can see why I'm sharing it. I have to say, I have met Giovanni online a couple of times, so he's in my network. But my ego took a big boost that the company name actually means something to people and it's quoted. But at the same time, on a serious note, I wanted to highlight not just the point that he makes, that creativity is about individuals being in a creative state and then the group coming together as in a creative state, which is a very brilliant point and actually something we forget sometimes. But he also said about being safe and ready psychologically to be creative. And sometimes, again, not just psychologically, but also the context, especially if we're working remotely, especially if we're working from home. Sometimes we forget that we are logging into a session where we do need to be at our optimal. And what are we going to do about our context, our surroundings, our mindset? So, and then of course the facilitator helps with all of that, but individually there's a lot of responsibility. So those were a couple of points, and I want to go a bit further to say that of course a remote team can creatively work together and even strive to work towards a creative output asynchronously. So meetings are synchronous communication. They're an example of synchronous communications, and it's just one way to tap into team creativity. We have to stop thinking that we can only create together when we are conversing at the same time. And that's the whole point of online tools, is that we can continue to have conversations, we can brainstorm, we can discuss, we can build on others' ideas, also asynchronously. And I think we're all starting to come to the conclusion that the mixture is what makes it really powerful. So I'm going to add another article here, which if you're interested in this stuff, I hope you will enjoy it. And it's relatively new. So from the 28th of July, I am recording on the 7th of August. And it's called Remote Ideation, Synchronous and Asynchronous. And it's a really good article explaining the pros and cons of generating ideas in a remote team, both in real time and not. And to be honest, this article can be read by teams of any co-located nature, remote nature, because as we know, many teams now use pretty much the same tools as remote teams, but they have the office as an extra communication tool. So that's one article for you. I do have another one. I do have another article for you, also almost fresh off the online press. And again, it's about this conversation that that there are ways of communicating where we're not talking to each other real time. So those of you who are regular listeners to the show might remember the wonderfully generous Marcus Vermuth from Buffer telling us about how his team were setting up an experiment to reduce meetings. And the reason for this was because suddenly one of their team members moved across the world and they were really spread across time zones. And this was making it difficult for, again, going back to Giovanni's point, of everyone being comfortable and ready for meetings because the time zones were, they were preventing this. So in episode 195 called Empowering Across Time Zones, he was telling us they were starting that. And now one of his team members has written an article about the experiment and it's really worth reading. More than anything, even if what they're describing doesn't work for you, the article just shows the importance of constantly reviewing how we're working together and adapting our communication to our current situation. Where are we now? Not the situation as it was months ago or even years ago. Again, those of you who have been listening for a while might be tired of hearing me say, if we go remote and when we go remote or when we start to look at virtual team practices, we have to start thinking about how we're working together, which is something that we usually don't do unless we really have to. So again, I recommend the articles just to get you in that mindset of thinking, okay, what is working, what isn't working? And I'll stick the article, Maya will stick the link to the article in the show notes, and it's in the Open Buffer blog. So if you've enjoyed those articles, then why not sign up to our monthly newsletter, because we send a couple of articles through a month. You can sign up over at virtualnotdistant.com, look for the inspiration page. And by the way, as this is part of the What's Going On segment, well, at Virtual Not Distant, our website is going through some changes. It's becoming more colorful and more face-friendly. So do pop over and do let us know what you think. I'll be delighted to hear from you. You can email me directly, pilar@virtualnotdistant.com, or you can use the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. So that's the end of the first What's Going On section. Do let me know if you have anything to share. We record a few weeks in advance, so we won't be like there and then. For that, you have to follow us on Twitter at PilarOrti is my handle. But now let's hear from Luis. I'll be back with some thoughts on remote teams with people from different nationalities later, and we'll end with a little contribution from another guest. Well, for today's 21st Century Work Life segment, I am delighted to welcome Luis Magalhaes from DistantJob and other things. Luis, did I say your name correctly?
Yeah, that was good. Thank you, Pilar. And happy to be here.
Can you say it for our listeners?
Yeah, so my name is Luis Magalhaes.
Excellent. One of the reasons I wanted to speak with you on the podcast, well, one is because I was on the DistantJob podcast and I had a really good time. So I thought, let's do it again.
Thank you.
And also, when I looked into your LinkedIn profile, you had Director of Marketing at DistantJob, dental surgeon at Vital 3M, and then podcast host at ENE3. And I've never had someone on the show with 3 job titles. So how did you end up with all those job titles? What's your life been like?
They just kind of accumulated. But really, the director of marketing is the main thing. So the dental surgeon thing was my main job for a long time. That was my formal education. It was on dentistry, and after that I specialized in surgery. But now I practice it on occasion, more as just not to let my skill set go to waste, not to get rusty, than out of any actual business-like practice. And podcast host, that was something that I started on the side years ago, because I wanted to talk about video games with my friends, and we built a podcast out of that. And it was pretty cool. That I learned a lot of what I do today from video game projects, actually.
All those 3 things are very interesting, and I'm sure that listeners will be curious as well. So I thought I could just look at first what the director of marketing job looks like and how you work in that. And then we'll have a look at the dentistry, because I think that's fascinating. I've never had a dentist on the show. And then we can talk a little bit about the podcast and all the video game stuff and more your personal stuff. So let's hear a bit about DistantJob, just to give us a quick overview of what the company does.
Well, DistantJob is a remote placement company. And by that, we really are targeted at promoting remote work to businesses that are still more or less not completely in the remote work space, but interested in using remote work to enable their growth, to enable their scaling. So what we do is we remove the hassle from hiring remotely. We do the full recruitment process. We have a whole recruiting network. So when someone, let's say that you, Pilar, need an expert audio engineer, wherever you're based, you have trouble finding it because the people around there have already been eaten up by larger podcasts, and you can't really find an audio engineer available that meets your standards. So you come to DistantJob and we search all around the world. We have a big network of recruiters. The recruiters will find you, one of the best people in the world. And then we actually take care of all the contractual and HR stuff for you. So really, it's your employee. You get an audio engineer working, on your company, but we handle all the payment and contractual stuff and, and vacation. So what this enables people to do is you can really start having your remote employee and a remote person working for you without going through all the corporate hassle of figuring out how you do taxes in this country, what you should do contractually if you're hiring outside of your country. So DistantJob doesn't really have a lot to offer to a big company that already has offices in multiple places around the world because they already have their global HR structure figured out. But for a smaller business that might only have, let's say, offices within the US, we can enable them to find global talent without having to worry about the logistics.
So it's my contract with DistantJob. I don't have a contract with the person as business owner?
Yes, you have a contract with DistantJob, but in that contract, it's specified that we have no idea what that person is doing for you. We don't interfere at all. If you had an office, they would come into your office and work side by side with your people.
I'm outsourcing that people, not the people management side, but the logistics of hiring. I'm outsourcing that to DistantJob in a way.
Exactly. We don't like to use the outsourcing word because the outsourcing word implies that you don't really have control over your employees.
Yeah.
And that's our whole shtick. For all intents and purposes, they are your employees, though we handle the paperwork and all of that.
Yeah, so in a way, I think that the old equivalent would be almost not a temp agency, but that kind of thing in a longer
right.
term.
You are exactly right.
Yeah.
We started by using those terms, but people were a bit confused by them, so we dropped them. We also don't like temp because just from an ethical side of the business, we like to say that we're in the business of finding people great, long-term fulfilling jobs, and that really doesn't fit the temporary mold. We would prefer, the people that we place in companies to have long, prosperous careers in those companies.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. I have one question. Somewhere looking at your stuff, you said Director of Marketing and EIC. Now, excuse my ignorance, what is EIC?
It's Editor-in-Chief.
Right.
That is probably the position that I have held the most throughout my life. Because I kind of got it when I was like 18. I was, working part-time at a Portuguese video game website, one of the real ones, not like an amateur blog, the ones that were actually in touch with the video game companies and getting free games and all of that and promotional opportunities. And suddenly, throughout the course of 1 month, everyone just dropped and left, and it was just the owner and myself, and the owner would turn to me and congratulations, you're editor-in-chief, now go and build me a team. And I'm like, okay. So I guess this is something for my CV.
Well, I really liked it. So what does that involve then at DistantJob?
What part? The editor-in-chief or the director of marketing?
Both. And how do you split your time between them, or how do you know which role you're fulfilling?
Badly. That's how I split my time between them. As you probably noticed by my description of the company, we are a very niche market. We don't really have a lot to offer to huge, global companies. It's hard to justify, our work for small outfits. Like, for example, if your company is 1 or 2 people, you're probably not looking for an employee right now, right? You're probably still bootstrapping with freelancing. So we have a sweet spot that we usually deal the best with companies that have between 20 to 100 employees. And there's a lot of noise in the internet, and it's hard to get through to that. And I'm still figuring it out. Part of my job as director of marketing is trying to come up with, following the scientific method, really, elaborating an hypothesis, mm-hmm. bringing that hypothesis to my bosses, which are, the president of DistantJob, Sharon Koifman, and the vice president, Rustam, basically convincing them that I have this hypothesis. If you guys give me this money and these other resources, I can test it for 3 months. And after 3 months, I will know if it's effective. And if it's effective, it almost usually gives out the profit or pays for itself, or if it's a bust. And there are more busts. Because it's a whole new world, this internet marketing thing. We have a very niche business, so there are more busts than successes. But usually, the successes make up for the busts.
And then, what about the editor-in-chief role?
One of the things that works out very well in terms of enabling, and you know this better than me because you have like hundreds and hundreds of blog posts, but people talk about SEO a lot. And the smartest people that I've talked to say that the best SEO is good content. Really, having good content is what makes you visible to search engines, and what makes you visible to search engines is what brings people brings the eyeballs to whatever you're doing. So as an editor-in-chief, I really try to promote the creation of valuable written content. I have a stable of freelance writers that I work with. I basically guide them into figuring out what are the most useful topics that they can write about in the area of leadership, remote leadership, and we try to produce valuable content every week. We don't always succeed, but I think that our success rate is pretty good. We have an average of 2 articles per week plus 1 podcast. So that's 3 pieces of content that, as editor-in-chief, I try to make sure they are as valuable as possible, to our target audience.
So a couple of things there. That's a lot of content, and that's a very new thing for businesses to be doing, which is putting out stuff for free. Okay, it is part of our marketing strategy. As you say, it's part of our search engine optimization, sometimes referred to as inbound marketing, where we're bringing people in by pushing content out. But this is a very new thing that companies are doing, because traditionally you would generate a lot of stuff and then sell it or be part of your own journal, a very closed thing. But now we're going, here, have all this for free.
Yeah. Well, but that's, it's a karma-based economy, right?
Maybe.
No, but
it's a good hypothesis.
Why should people care about me? Really, I'm a drop in the ocean, and DistantJob is also a drop in the ocean. So you have to provide some value. You have to say, hey, you know what? You have no reason to care about me. You have no reason to care about what you do. There's a big, wide world out there, and everything is trying to grab your attention. But look, I'm providing you with something that's actually quality and that's actually useful, and you go and you grab it, and hopefully it will improve your life and your business or whatever. And you don't need to give me anything else. That's fine. And my expectation is that maybe if sometime, in the next 6 months, those people are successfully applying whatever I enable them to apply, and they need to hire someone, a light bulb goes in their mind and they say, hey, those guys treated me well, 6 months ago. And I remember reading something about them helping me hire people. So let me go and check it out. And that's really how I view it. And that's because that's why I consume things. I almost never buy anything unless I've had a previous relationship with the people selling it from before.
Yeah, that's been made very easy by the internet. One question I wanted to ask you, you were saying that you help your freelancers decide on what to write. Do you do that as a team or with individuals?
Both, I'd say. Mm-hmm. I'd say both. We have transparent live discussions on the Trello board. Anyone can weigh in, but really, it's. It's basically I'm having one-on-one conversations with the writers, but in the Trello board, so anyone can weigh in.
Mm-hmm. So you discuss with them individually, but those conversations are open so that everyone knows what's happening, but you don't collectively as a team decide on what you're going to be working.
We do that in the marketing team when it comes again to the experiments and to the projects and to that, because it makes sense to be more structured. But in writing, I may be completely wrong in this, but when it comes to actually writing pieces, writing is a very personal thing. And I don't think that things that are written by committee are as interesting.
So I was talking, yes, I think you're completely right, although some people can write together, but I think that needs to be a very special relationship. But I was not asking about the writing, but about deciding what the articles are going to be about. Is that also something that takes place in a one-to-one, but openly?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that takes place in a one-to-one. And look, and a lot of times, what happens more often is not that we brainstorm topics, is that I've worked with the writers for long enough now, and that they usually come with me with the topic and bounce the topic off me.
Mm-hmm.
And I either have an opinion on it, or then I bring it back, to the marketing team and ask them, what do they think about that?
How long have you been doing this particular job at DistantJob?
I think it's been like 2 years. It's a bit fuzzy because I started working for them as a freelance writer, and then I started working for them as a part-time marketer. And it was only after some time of that they invite me to come full-time as director of marketing.
Yeah. So before I go to my next question, that's also interesting that it is a remote company and you're still able to progress. So this really is 21st century.
Oh yeah.
So during that time, during those 2 years, is there anything from what you've been seeing from the content that you've been putting out? Is there anything that has changed your own way of working or your own practice, or not really?
Constantly. I mean, seriously, it's just, where should I start?
Pick one thing. I don't know.
Okay, so I had this podcast episode recently with Mulud Nouri, who is an agile coach, and just a couple of words, she shifted my way of thinking about Basecamp, because I was we had switched from Trello to Basecamp, the main team. I still use Trello for the writers, but everything else is done on Basecamp, and I was basically, I was internally moaning just about, Basecamp doesn't have this and doesn't have that, and I can't even have the Kanban board that's so visual that I like. And then Mulud Nouri, she kind of did the word, mind trick with me, saying, but Luis, if you look at Basecamp's task lists just in this way, you can actually use them as if they were cards in a Kanban board. And I'm like, oh, this is true. And so it kind of changed my perspective on maybe I should stop moaning, about this change, because it obviously has positives. Otherwise, we wouldn't have made the change. And instead of looking at the things that are missing, I could, see how those things aren't actually missing. It's just my mind that was fixed into that, very strict structure from before. So, that was something. From Lisette Sutherland, I got the idea, the appreciation of how important it is to set a team agreement. And I actually set my marketing team agreement after my call with her, and a couple of weeks later made it public so that anyone else with a remote marketing team can grab it and copy it in its entirety, or change it wherever they feel like changing it. I've made it public. The action of make it public, I actually took from my conversations with Katie Womersley and Marcus Wormuth from Buffer, who I also interviewed, and they really imprinted upon me how important it is to be transparent in the work, so that you can, gather more feedback from sources both within and without the company. So, I think it's harder to find an interview that hasn't made an impact on me.
This concept of making our work visible beyond our four walls is very new. It's interesting. So you've said that it can give you feedback and stuff. Is there anything else that you think that has given you, saying, okay, we're going to put our team agreement out in the open?
I've definitely noticed an effect. It's not as important in DistantJob because hiring is our whole business. So whenever we need candidates, we can always get them very easily. But there have definitely been people that have reached in touch to me and say, hey, DistantJob is so transparent. I love that. It's probably a great place to work. Would you have a job for me? So it's definitely great when it comes to attracting talent. It hasn't been game-changing for us just because hiring talent is our bread and butter.
But hopefully it's helping you to hire the right people even more. Because somebody who's saying, I like that you're open, is already someone who, okay, they know what they would be getting into. And this is something that I think many companies are missing out on by not being more open about how they operate.
I agree. I agree absolutely. Companies are missing out on great talent by not doing it.
On the right talent.
Yeah, exactly, on the right talent. But I just don't think that it's our case specifically, because that's part of our process. We don't look just for skills when we're looking for employees for us or for our clients. This is actually something that I learned from my VP, from the vice president of DistantJob, Rustam Havardi. I'm sorry, Rustam, if I just said your name incorrectly. Your name isn't that much easier than mine. But anyway, what he did as the vice president of the company, he took the time to know the culture of each client company inside out. And I just don't mean, it wasn't really just a surface level thing. He would know what kind of flowers to buy for the wife of the vice president of a client company. He really goes in, close and personal. He knows what those guys do. He knows how they work. So from day one, we've always been focused on finding the right people. So we could always find very well the right people for us and for our clients. But I agree with you. If you are doing your own hiring efforts, then transparency really will net you the right people.
Good, really interesting also to see how your inbound marketing is actually helping your own processes and your own way of working. What a fantastic place to be in. So let's hear now more about your dentistry. I read somewhere that you'd written you had a passion for dentistry. So what is it that attracted you to the job in the first place, and why do you still carry on doing it even if you've got other stuff to be getting on with?
Well, again, as I told you in the beginning, I don't do it. I almost don't do it. It takes about 5% of my time.
Okay,
realistically, I'm not placed in any dental clinic. I have people that I work with, friends in the surgery world that I talk to and say, do you have any interesting case? Would you like any help with that? Can I go and work with you on that? Just so I don't lose the skill, just so I don't lose the practice. Now, the passion for it really comes from the intersection between science, medicine, diagnostics, which I love. It really is those Dr. House moments are really incredible. When you are looking at the patient and trying to figure out what's wrong with them, trying to find out as many data points about that person and their condition and assembling it all in a puzzle to figure out what's the problem. A lot of what I do on a daily basis is knowledge work. I'm working with my brain. Then my hands, the hardware slaps against the keyboard and makes things appear on the screen. But dental medicine, dentistry, surgery, it's something that you're doing with your hands, and you're using your hands to make something better. So I see dental medicine as a cross between, science, medicine, and art, because any person out of dental school can basically sculpt a tooth, but a tooth can be a great tooth, can be very good. It can be very good for chewing. It can be very good for cutting, but maybe it doesn't look that great, or maybe it can look great. It can be the most beautiful tooth that you have ever looked at, but it's useless in its function. You can actually produce a part of a human being there that's going to accompany them throughout their lives, and that it's going to have an aesthetic function, it's going to have a mechanical function, it's going to influence their quality of life. It really is making art with the human being, and that's lovely. There's really nothing like that.
So is it really about fulfilling something within you that you enjoy doing, and that you don't, like you said, you don't want to lose that craft? Is that what it's about for you then?
Yeah, it's totally about the craft. Realistically, when it comes to impact, my work in DistantJob probably makes a lot more impact than my work as a dental surgeon, because as you probably get a lot of fulfillment from this, because we are promoting a healthier lifestyle for hundreds of people. I'm helping people find their best jobs in their life. Now, I'm doing that indirectly because I'm not really in recruitment. The company is recruitment, but what I really do is I convince companies to hire the people that my company can find. So it's a bit of a roundabout way to go there. But ultimately, I'm helping open more remote work spaces, more remote work possibilities, more remote work placement opportunities in the world. And this really changes lives because, people get to have a better work-life balance. They find more focus in their work, and hence their work is more fulfilling. They can spend more time with their families. that's changing a lot of lives for the better. Now, when I'm changing lives for the better as a dentist, I'm doing it on an individual basis. It doesn't scale. So, in terms of impact in the world, it's not the same thing. But it's really fulfilling to do that work with your hands and to see the immediate impact.
Nice. It's nice to know what the different kinds of work bring us and what we bring to the world through them. Really interesting. Again, another very 21st century mindset thing. Some stuff that actually probably 50 years ago we wouldn't be talking as much about. So finally, Luis, this stuff that you do with video games, is this, what do you do? Is this something else that you're interested in? Tell us about that.
I'm where I am in my life now because of video games. That really is the crux of the situation. And my parents, that I think that those were the two most influential forces in my life. It was the constant support of my parents and the constant inspiration from video games. It was the love of video games that led me to start writing. It was through video games that I learned how to coordinate people over the internet. So I wouldn't have the job I have right now if it wasn't for video games. It was my experiences with video games that afforded me the opportunity to train my capacity to visualize things in three-dimensional space that allowed me to perform well as a dentist. So I think that video games are a very underrated art form, but at the same time, they aren't. Since they're such a commercial product and everyone is working on them these days because they have, get rich doing this dreams. There's also a lot of trash, frankly, junk, video games that aren't worth anything around, which wasn't the case when I was young. There was like a new video game coming out every month, maybe two. Now there's like hundreds every month. The signal to noise ratio really boomed. But yeah, maybe wouldn't be a writer if I didn't want to start writing about video games. I maybe wouldn't be a marketer and especially not know how to coordinate someone over the internet if I hadn't done that for years doing video games. I wouldn't have that notion of the pleasure of creating something with my hands if I didn't have the spatial reasoning that I practiced in video games. And this, again, the reason I started doing my show about video games was because I see the impact that video games had in my life, and I don't see that video games being taught in that way in society. And I feel that we're missing something, and I don't know quite what it is. I have these loose ideas about video games and the impact they had in my life, but I really haven't understood how to put them all together into a coherent philosophy. But I don't think that anyone else is doing that. So it's something that I explore on and off, if that makes any sense.
Yes, well, you're starting to do that actually, because you've dissected which parts of how it has impacted the different parts of your life. You talked about the writing, the coordination, and the spatial reasoning. So you're already doing that. I think if you continue doing focusing on what you're doing for yourself, you can probably start to branch that out. It's really nice to hear something like that, because I feel like that about a lot of stuff, that it's something that gets put in a box of this is bad for you, or this has been shown to be bad in X, Y, and Z, or whatever. No one's looking at, okay, but what if this is helping with this? What if this helps with this? And have you really looked at cases like yours, Luis, where actually this has enabled you to get certain skills, mindsets, whatever, that have enabled you to move forward in a different way?
I honestly don't know if I will ever able to have a coherent theory formed, but it really, and this is part of why I scale down my presence in social media, because it's just agonizing to me to see what people are writing about video games. it's just not interesting. It feels that everyone is missing the point. When I read about video games, and it's always about the same thing. It's always about this character is weird, or this character doesn't perform as I imagine it that the character in this situation would perform, or the gameplay is this and that, and that it feels like so many people are missing the plot. I don't know. It doesn't resonate with me, anything that I read about video games.
Very interesting, and something I didn't expect to come up during the conversation. So listeners, hey, be surprised with us. Are you still doing the EN3 podcast, or has that stopped? I think I
took a year off, and I'm probably because what I just discussed, the things that I just told you, I felt that I wasn't doing a good job of making them come across on the podcast. So I decided to take a year off to talk to a few people to try to put these thoughts in writing in some form before I could restart the podcast in a way that would do justice to these ideas.
I think what you're saying also resonates with me, because I feel like that in the remote space. I mean, I've been around only for a few years, and sometimes I'm reading stuff and going, yes, but no, we need to go further. We need to look at the different facets of this. So yeah, I suppose when you start to really get into a space very deeply and also go into the philosophical space as you're seeing, and really go beyond what's staring you in the eye, it can get like that. Good. Well, I hope you take on the podcast again, because obviously you have a lot to say in that space, and I think it's a great vehicle for sharing that. So I'm just going to start to wrap up, Luis, and also say you've also have you got a piece of fiction out there also?
Oh yeah, so I actually have a best-selling fantasy novel in Portuguese, and I want to be sure that people understand that the bestseller in Portugal is like 4,000 copies, so it's not much. Portuguese market is very small for fantasy novels. Last month, I launched my first fantasy novel in English, but it's just been so busy at DistantJob that I have done zero marketing on it. I hope to when I take my next vacation, like next month, I hope to be able to really dive deep into properly marketing it. But yeah, I like writing fiction, fantasy fiction. Yet another thing that I got from video games, and my other passion, that is, reading.
Yeah. So A Silvery Moon is the title in English, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. And in Portuguese, for those Portuguese-speaking listeners that I know listen to the show?
Oh, it's A Filha do Gelo. That roughly translates to the daughter of ice, or ice's daughter. I don't know I haven't figured out which is best for the English translation.
Okay. Good stuff. So you have a blog which you write in both English and Portuguese. Do you write separately, or does Google translate it for you?
No. I actually, sometimes I refer to Google Translate because it's just easier. But I do my translations manually. So everything that you find in the blog will have a Portuguese version and an English version, and this is actually something that came about due to a video game. So. It's The Phantom Pain, the Metal Gear Solid The Phantom Pain by Hideo Kojima. That game has a very understated plot point that's about the importance of language as a cultural virus. And what I learned from that video game is that because English is the de facto lingua franca of most of the civilized world, of all the civilized world, let's say, or most of it, the Western world, certainly, our culture is basically a reflection of British culture in a sense, but essentially, and let's say Anglo-Saxon culture. So, and after playing that video game, I thought about that game, and I thought, yeah, Omar, that's right. Sometimes I think in English. And that comes really at the expense of my cultural heritage as a Portuguese. And that's not to say, I don't want to say that the Portuguese culture is superior. All that I meant to say is that we lose a lot when all of our media, or most of our media consumption, originates in one of two countries, whose language is basically English. So I decided to start writing in Portuguese and then translating myself to English, because that was a way to have my mind working in both languages and in a way in both cultures. And I really see the benefits of that. Because what happens now is that when I write something in Portuguese and then I translate it to English, then sometimes I go back and change something in the Portuguese version or vice versa. Because it really is, if your brain is your operative system, each language you work with is a different version of that operative system. And sometimes they have different apps.
Nice analogy, Luis. So if people want to read your stuff, of course, we'll put a link in the show notes. You need to say the URL yourself, I think.
It's myname.com.
Yes.
It's www.luisfalcaomagalhaes.com. So without any, again, see, this is something that doesn't happen in English. You don't put, little dots over the vowels. So This is the example of something that, culturally English speakers would never be aware of, that you have to paraphrase saying that the URL or the email address doesn't have those dots on the vowels.
Yeah. Yeah. And any other websites we should refer listeners to?
Well, I'm really proud of the Distant Job podcast. So really, if you go to distantjob.com, there's a podcast button on the top right corner. Great insights, into people that are trying to figure this remote thing out. And I think that it's an incredible amount of resources for anyone that's trying to lead or build or manage a remote team. So, yeah.
Well, listeners, I think you will enjoy that. We have already recommended it to Virtual Not Distant newsletter subscribers. So go ahead, distantjob.com, but also have a look at the blog as well as the podcast. And also, in your podcast app or your phone, you can just look for Distant Job in your podcast app and subscribe through there. Luis, thank you very much for your time and your insight and your openness.
Well, thank you, Pilar. And thank you for all that you're doing. Before I got you on as a guest in the podcast, I didn't know about your work, about your blog, and about your podcast. And it's just a treasure trove of content. So, if your listeners haven't explored it yet, they really should, because there's a great education doing there. And thank you for being part of this remote culture shift in the world. I really think that we're doing is important work, and I wouldn't be able to do it alone. No one would be able to do it alone. So we're all in this together.
Well, thank you, Luis, for taking us down lots of different conversations and aspects of work and how work is evolving in the 21st century. And I really enjoyed the fact that the conversation took us from being a content marketing manager for DistantJob to how the fact that using English so often can start to affect your heritage or your feeling of heritage if you come from a non-English speaking country. And something that came to mind when listening back to this interview, which I think we recorded back in May, and it's now August, so apologies, Luis. Something that came to mind was how much we need to remember this in global teams if we're using one language as a main language. The fact that using different languages is about accessing different parts of ourselves, I imagine. And it's not just about dexterity with the language. It's also about the effort that it might take some people, for example, at certain times of day or when their lives are quite full on, the effort might be extra to communicate in a language within which they need to make an effort. And I might just be saying this to remind myself, if I'm honest, because my first spoken language is Spanish, but my first written language is English. And my first academic language is English. I went to British school. And my first work language is English. So I'm much more comfortable talking to you in English about work. But sometimes I'm freer if we're talking about some personal stuff. Maybe I'm freer in Spanish. I haven't monitored myself. I know both languages at some point just crack. And I'm not dexterous in any of them. So, wonderful word. So, but to be honest, I sometimes forget when I am working with other people who are from a different nationality and who are speaking English at work, and we're starting to go a little bit deeper, because some of the work I do does involve bringing, okay, what am I feeling about this, and how am I dealing with this, and what is this doing to my connection with the work and the people? And sometimes I forget that that some people are not used to talking about that kind of stuff in English, for example. So, like me, maybe you or someone you know is in the same situation, and it's just interesting to remember all of this. So also, I think it's important to remember to open up different communication channels within a team, and this especially if there's a diversity of language proficiency. And going back to what I was saying back at the beginning in the updates, in the what's going on segment, maybe in an online team, it's about mixing synchronous with asynchronous communication, and it's giving time for people to contribute to decision making. For example, not always relying on meetings, but having some kind of pre-meeting, post-meeting time frame within which people can think through and articulate their thoughts. And it's also about mixing text with audio, with video. It can be very tiring, especially if we're making the transition, but we need to be aware that some people can be left behind if we stick to one method. So traditionally, virtual teams, can't believe I'm using traditionally in this context, but anyway, before audio and video was so accessible, we used to rely on written communication all the time. And that is why recruitment focused a lot on very good communication skills if we're working remotely or globally even. And in some companies like Automatic, which again, I mentioned earlier on, they rely, or at least used to, on long form blog posts as communication to stay updated with what's going on in the different teams. So writing skills there are essential. But now this doesn't need to be the case in every company. Asynchronous communication can also involve audio, for example, or even video. 10 years ago, to create a piece of audio or video or just to leave a note to your team would have been a big hassle, but now? So that's also something to look out for in recruitment. What is online communication like in your team or organization? And what kind of person will thrive in that environment? Or do you need to change how you communicate in your team when somebody new joins you? Something else to remember is that while real-time communication, especially with video, is often referred to as the best way to communicate in a remote team, if there are people with different language proficiencies in your team, then consider that sometimes writing might be preferable. And sometimes video might be preferable because you can use you can see each other's faces, etc. But sometimes written can be preferable. It all depends. So this is not so cultural. Communicating across cultures is not my area of expertise, but I would like to refer you back to Alon Shevat's comment at the end of the last episode when he talked about introversion, and he said that sometimes for people who are not that comfortable talking in the team's main language, it might be better for communication to be written. So another point to take into consideration, might be worth having a conversation. You can double check. So, right, I would love to hear your experience around all of this, what you think, what your comments are. If you disagree, if you agree, feel free to get in touch via email, pilar@virtualnotdistant.com, or we do have a contact form on the website, virtualnotdistant.com. If you want to share your experiences and don't mind me sharing them on the podcast, let me know, because I would love to have more voices to enrich the conversation. Now, adding to Luis's interview, let's hear a little bit about the evolution of search engine optimization and where it might all well be going. So here is Jeremiah Smith, founder and CEO of Simple Tiger, a boutique digital marketing agency where they specialize in SEO and content marketing for SaaS companies, that is software as a service companies. So take it away, Jeremiah.
Yeah, so I think search engine optimization has changed quite significantly in the past 20 years. So, 20 years ago, it really kind of started, I would say, with Google, and then blew up significantly over time and has relied on usually the same few small pieces for all this time. And then every once in a while, a new piece gets added or pieces get rearranged just a little bit. But things had largely stayed the same for most of the past 20 years. But in the past about year or two, we've seen some major changes where we now have an artificially intelligent engine versus just an algorithmic machine, which there's a difference there. The algorithmic machine just follows a single set of rules, and your result is based on your input versus those rules. And so that's an algorithmic engine versus artificially intelligent. Artificially intelligent follows whatever rules it deems are important to generate the results that it knows need to be generated. And so that handles things very differently. So with this artificially intelligent search engine, we're seeing some really wild results and some really unusual things happening. But if you really understand the purpose of Google and the purpose of artificial intelligence and things like that, you'll understand why we're seeing what we're seeing and what to do about it. As things progress, I think we're going to see more of a shift away from how things used to be, because search is going to just continue to be a difficult thing for the world to wrap their hands around and for Google to manage well. And it's not just Google. There are many other search engines out there. Amazon's a great example of one that's just popped up on the scene very recently in terms of search dominance. Outpacing Bing and Yahoo, but just focused on product search, right? Or transactional search, I should say. So that's an interesting aspect of search that I think is evolving. And then we have app stores and music searching tools and all this kind of stuff. So, the search is really getting segmented, and it's growing and evolving in a major way. I think it's going to continue to grow. And insofar as SEO is concerned with Google, I think we're going to see an evolution where the artificially intelligent engine is running things at such an optimal pace because humans are constantly informing that engine what we like, what we don't like, what we meant when we searched a certain keyword, versus what we actually searched. And Google's going to get good at figuring out our searcher's intent. And over time, I think we're going to see just honestly a stronger and stronger competition in search engine optimization. And the spoils, I think, are going to go to those people who have figured out how to do it the right way and have been doing it the right way all along. And when I say the right way, I really mean for the long term. So, there's always been the black hat side and the white hat side. And there's a big gray area in between, because who's determining which hat we're talking about here, right? So really, Google's trying to determine that and tell us here's something we consider black hat, and this is the white hat way to do it. So if you are authentically generating content and you are authentically communicating with your audience and you are running a well-built website, it's nice and clean, it works well, and you provide good user experience from before the customer knows about you all the way through to being a paid customer and then beyond. So an ongoing customer, Google is going to monitor all of that, and they're going to reward you well if you do a good job of that. And that applies to a tiny business who's starting out of someone's basement all the way up to, Fortune 500 corporations.
Well, thank you so much, Jeremiah, to whom I actually talked quite a few months ago now. Now, listeners, if there's anything you would like us to cover, let me know. If you have any questions about leading remote teams, I'd be happy to answer them here. We'd be happy if there's a guest or Maya. If you have a question, it might well be of use to someone else also. Remember, open conversations are an element of visible teamwork. And I know we're not a team, but you know what I mean. And also, now we have a podcast contributor form you can fill in to contribute in whichever way you prefer. And Maya will stick the show notes, the link in the show notes there. We'll be changing the format of the show soon to focus even more on leading remote teams and remote collaboration in general. So do stay in touch. And if you haven't done so yet, sign up to our newsletter. Okay, I'll leave you with myself doing the outro. A big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast produced by Virtual Not Distant. If you have something to add to the conversation, let us know through the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. I have been your host, Pilar Orti, and I'm signing off now. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.